Welcome everyone. This is our transition to secondary school workshop for parents and carers of autistic children in Wandsworth. And it's on behalf of Wandsworth Autism Advisory Service. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are going to start by talking about transitions generally and why that might be a time of heightened anxiety for our young people. Obviously, starting secondary school is a really big deal in every child's life. And I think especially so for our autistic children, because we know that they do have challenges with changes to routine, and virtually everything about their routine is going to change. So we're going to be thinking today about how we can best support that and facilitate that to kind of keep their levels of anxiety under control. And we're going to offer some kind of suggestions or helpful tips which we have found useful previously. Suggestions of things that you could try out with your child in advance of September, and then in the first days and weeks when they start, and then there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. So, hopefully, at your child's primary school, they will have some transition work specifically planned for the summer term. So at WAS, we do offer a program of transition support to primary schools in the borough. So we share resources of our transition program. So what that might look like, things like, group activities and suggested kind of topics to cover and stuff like that. The kind of this is a sort of a rough guide of areas that we would expect to be covered in those sessions. So it would be things like what's going to be the same about secondary school and what might be different to how they're used to in primary school. Obviously, meeting new people is a really key anxiety that lots of children have. The sort of introductions, how to introduce yourself to unfamiliar people, that kind of thing. Self-help skills is really key. I think like developing advocacy in children, because it's obviously really important to build those skills of resilience and sort of encouraging them to ask for help when they need it, or say when they don't understand something, or I think like hopefully everyone's familiar with the term masking, and we often find that children are nervous about putting their hand up or asking questions, or it might be something that they're suppressing or anxious, and then perhaps those opportunities and moments are lost, and their anxiety builds that way. So I think it's really important it's kind of like a muscle. You have to practice those skills. They don't necessarily come naturally, especially if your child is quite shy. That might not be something that they're used to. I think in primary school, especially if they have good relationships with adults around them, their teacher or teaching assistant might know them very well and know what signs to look out for, that they might be having a hard time, or they might be anxious about something or not coping well. And in secondary school, obviously, like adults will be unfamiliar to them. They won't know what signs to look out for. So it's really, really important more than ever that they're able to sort of ask for help and advocate for themselves in that way. But
Mm.
it might not be something they've been used to have to do, if you see what I mean. Bullying is often something that young people raise as a topic they're anxious about in relation to secondary school. And obviously people can experience bullying in primary school also. So hopefully they will have done some work around that. I know most schools do like anti-bullying week and things like that. That's covered in primary school, but bullying, I think, yeah, does tend to come up quite a bit as an anxiety young people feel in relation to secondary school. So we would sort of cover that a bit. And organization skills, that is huge in terms of, we know that lots of neurodivergent people have challenges in executive functioning skills. So that impacts virtually every area of our lives, and definitely in relation to starting a new school or job, there's all kinds of considerations with regards to, they'll have a new timetable, a schedule, they'll have to they'll have a new kind of structure to their day that they'll have to get their head around. The way that lessons are divided up, um, with different teachers for different subjects and different rooms that they have to move around school to get to. These are all really key areas of challenge for many of our children, because just because they're not used to doing things that way. Primary schools tend to be much smaller. You usually have most of your subjects in the same classroom with the same teacher, and so it is quite a big change to sort of get your head around. And
Yeah.
we'll look at emotions more generally as well, about how to manage difficult emotions, or recognize signs of anxiety, or that kind of thing. And yeah, we'll look a bit at some of the other challenges that they might experience in relation to starting a new school. And many of those would be general, like I said, the anxieties that they might feel doing anything for the first time, whether it's, joining a new club, or starting a new hobby, or meeting new people in any context, can be challenging. But I think there are some challenges relating specifically to starting a new school, and secondary school in particular, that we would sort of focus on and look at in more depth. Okay.
Yeah, and I think also this slide's just to say that this is some support that should be available in school. So just to be aware that like school should be running some groups or some, yeah, small group work for children who might need extra help in these areas, I think, as well. So just good to be aware of, really.
Yeah. I think
Yeah, I think
if
you've highlighted a lot of these things already, Charlotte, and we probably don't
mm,
want to dwell too much on the scary stuff, but I suppose it's good to be aware of it, isn't it?
it is, I mean, for me, it's a tricky one, because obviously, we don't want to scare them. That's the first thing, is that obviously it's a fine line, isn't it, between, we don't want to introduce new anxieties that they hadn't thought of, but on the whole, most of these things have probably occurred to them, or, I mean, it definitely, your child best and what they're able to cope with, and how they usually go about things. And I think, more often than not, most children benefit from at least thinking through these things with an adult prior to it happening. So yeah, this is kind of a list of common challenges, I suppose. Some of the changes that they can expect. obviously a much larger group of pupils. In a primary school, they've got about 30 in their class, probably. They might, they might have even if they come from a large primary school that's sort of 2 or 3 formentary, that's still much, much smaller than any secondary school in Wandsworth. So they'll have many, many more students. And I think it just contributes to that feeling of kind of feeling a little bit more anonymous, a little bit less personable. Um, and yeah, you can feel a bit lost, especially in the first few days and weeks. And then obviously there's a lot of other things that come along with that, like noise levels and crowded corridors and that kind of thing. Um, yeah, we talked a little bit already about the different subject areas that, perhaps subjects will be called different things to what they're used to, and that sometimes throws children. So, even in primary schools, we have some people um, call it literacy. In other schools, it's still English, I think. In most schools, they might separate out phonics or guided reading or and all these labels are quite important if it's been referred to that way from reception or nursery all the way up to year 6, and then suddenly it's called something else. That in itself is quite disorienting. Um, and I think it's quite usual for say, for example, science to be split up into 3 separate subjects: biology, chemistry, and physics. So even just using those labels, it's a continuity because they're still going to be learning about science, but now it's called something else. And they might even have different teachers for those 3 different areas of science. So, it's a lot. And there might be new subjects that they haven't studied previously. Things like, I mean, they do like technology in primary school, but it might be called woodwork or textiles or food technology, or, whereas before it was just cooking. So yeah, all these different subjects have different names, and they might, even if they're called the same thing, they might look very different. So, obviously all children do PE in primary school, but in secondary school, suddenly they have an athletics track or a swimming pool or, equipment they've never used before. So yeah. Then we've got the sort of travel arrangements. So the journey to and from school is obviously going to be different. It's going to be in a physical different location, and you need to plan a route. You need to think about how you're going to get there, public transport, sort of, how independent is your child? How used to making journeys alone are they? Is that realistic for them? Will you need to drop off and collect them? Will school transport be provided? All of these sort of logistics to work through. And then there's also the sort of mental shift of being the oldest in the school and being allotted certain privileges for that. I remember when I was in year 6, we had the special status of being able to sit on the benches in assembly, and that seemed like a very, very big deal at the time, whereas everyone else had to sit on the floor. So there'll be certain, it might be that in your child's primary school, year 6 pupils can be like mentors or prefects, or um, maybe there was a head boy and head girl, and they had jobs like showing visitors around and things like that. That's all going to change now. And when they go into year 7, they're suddenly the youngest in the school, the babies, the ones who need help, the ones who, so it's quite a difference in mindset, I would say, being the new person, not knowing where things are or how to get places, or, knowing anything about the staff, and they'll have to rely on other children who are older for that sort of anecdotal information. can feel quite disempowering. Um, Obviously, it's quite usual as well to have a whole different variety of teachers for the different subject areas. And I think that poses a few issues because I think lots of children begun to really closely associate their enjoyment of a subject with how much they like or get on with a particular teacher and their personality. And it might be quite tricky in terms of there might be certain subjects that they excel at and that they enjoy much more, but whether or not that jives with how much they like the teacher of that subject is another thing. So I think just teachers, even if the school has a like behavior policy, it's natural that they would have different teaching styles and different sort of, methods. And that in itself is quite confusing to an autistic child, that some teachers are stricter than others. They might feel a sense of unfairness or injustice that, oh, this teacher dishes out detentions all the time, whereas another teacher never seems to give any, or that kind of thing. That's quite confusing, I think, for some children. Obviously, the building will be much larger, unfamiliar. Timetables will be different, the start of the day, the end of the day, lunch break. Um, Even just things like the bell to signal the start and end of lessons. In primary school, we never had a bell. Um, I think we had a physical bell for the end of break time and lunchtime, but we didn't have a like a tannoy where like the end of lessons was announced and then you had to change rooms, like that kind of thing. Even just the sound of the bell itself might be an issue sensory wise. And then, yeah, just getting used to a whole new routine in itself is very tricky. Often, I think secondary schools tend to have a slightly longer day. I know Ashcroft definitely does have a longer day in terms of the amount of hours timetabled. They probably will start earlier than they used to as well. I think most primary schools start at like 9 or quarter to 9. Um, Most secondary schools start at like a little bit earlier, maybe 8:30 or that kind of thing. So it might be that they have to get up earlier than they used to. They might have a longer journey to school. So it's just worth thinking about whether perhaps their bedtime needs to be adjusted in accordance with that to allow them enough time in the morning to get ready, have breakfast, get dressed, shower, all that stuff. So, I mean,
This just kind of summarizes it, doesn't it?
yeah, that's kind of basically what we're saying, and there's a link that I can share. I actually wrote a blog post for the Autism Education Trust about this, so that's available on their website. But it was basically quite an old post now, but it was discussing the challenges of preparing year six children for secondary school, for the start of secondary school. But it was kind of reflecting on that in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, we've come through that now and out the other side, thank goodness. But a lot of it is still applicable to now. Obviously, hopefully, things will have vastly improved for your child from a couple of years ago in the sense that, we're not in lockdown anymore. Hopefully, they'll have had the opportunity to visit their new school at least one occasion for some kind of transition day. Um, most schools offer a kind of
Yeah.
orientation type visit prior. So hopefully it's not quite such a difficult challenge as it was a few years ago, but even without all of that, it's still going to be probably quite tricky and anxiety provoking, I would say. So, yeah, this is kind of what I was saying before. We want to ideally try to strike the right balance between acknowledging that it will be a very tricky time, that you are there to listen, that you do care, that your child is gonna experience some big changes and that you want to support them through that. But then at the same time, we don't want to project our anxieties about that change
Mm.
onto them. And I think it is really difficult because obviously children pick up on things. They sense vibes and autistic children in particular can be incredibly intuitive to sort of awkward situations or difficult silences or funny moods or like they soak all of that up like sponges. So I think we as parents just have to be very mindful about how we speak about school generally, but in particular, secondary school as this sort of big, unknown, scary thing. We don't want to present it in those terms. We want to speak about it positively, obviously realistically as well, that it may also be difficult, but also it can be quite exciting. Like, especially if they've had a rough time in primary school and maybe have struggled to make friends, or they haven't really enjoyed school that much, or they had a difficult, tricky relationship with their teacher, maybe. This is an opportunity for a fresh start. I mean, that's a really good way to present it to children, that they're going to have the opportunity to make loads of new friends that, maybe don't know anything about their life up until then. It's kind of an opportunity for them to like reinvent themselves, to find other students who are interested in the same things that they are. Obviously, because there's a lot more children, there's going to be a much broader spectrum of interests and hobbies and things that they may have in common. So it may just be the absolute making of them. They might find their tribe,
Yeah.
if especially if their special interest is very, very niche, like they, only care about bugs and I don't know, snakes or geckos or whatever it is that they're into, Pokemon or Harry Potter, or I mean, it's almost guaranteed that they're going to find some kind of kindred spirit or little group who are into exactly the same things that they are, whether that's Taylor Swift or, um, you know, whatever it is, arts
Yeah.
and crafts, film,
So many
animation,
options.
computer gaming, whatever they're into, they're gonna find somebody at least, or even lots of children who like and enjoy exactly the same things they do, which that in itself is really cool and very exciting. So you want to kind of strike that balance. Yes, it will be tricky, but it may also be really fun and awesome. So let's sell it and kind of big it up in that way as well. So these are some examples of, so like we mentioned before, WAS does run a transition group ourselves in the summer holidays, and that won't be applicable for everyone because, like we were saying, we would hope that schools are running their own transition programs, because really this does come better from the adults that they already have a relationship with, that they know. Um, it is better delivered by them. But obviously, we know things happen, life happens, illnesses happen, absences happen, whatever it might be. Some children are always going to need a higher level of support in think more opportunities to think about the challenges of transition. So that's why we do offer a transition group from our service directly. But most of our work around transition is supporting schools with materials and resources, and a suggested structure to the transition program that they can run within school. But these are sort of example activities of what could be covered in those transition groups. And I
Mm.
think, to be
But there's no
honest,
reason like an activity like this you couldn't do at home as well.
exactly, exactly. And I think as well, most schools should be quite forthcoming about their program of transition support. It might be that they offer to um, share these materials with you, or they could give you just a general overview of what's going to be covered in the sessions. I would expect that to be sort of, you know, featured somewhere, whether it's a newsletter, the school website, whatever it might be. I think, yeah, just it's useful to consider in very general terms what will be the same and what will be different, because there will be, although we have focused on the differences, there is a lot that will be the same. It's going to be Monday to Friday, it's going to be a learning environment. It's going
Mm.
to be compulsory, unfortunately. You'll have the weekends off, you'll have the school holidays off, those will stay the same.
You might have the
Um,
same packed lunch still.
yeah, things like that.
Yeah,
So there will be areas of similarity, and it's important to acknowledge those as well, to sort of maybe hold on to those things that they hold dear and precious, because if it feels like everything's changing all at once, that can feel quite disorienting and overwhelming. So some children find it helpful to consider, okay, these are the small few things that will stay the same, that won't change, that I'll still have a sense of control over. Yeah.
definitely.
So, I mean, it's helpful to talk about emotions generally. So, transition or not, secondary or not, primary or not, difficult time, good time, regardless, we would always be encouraging, because we know that this is an area of challenge with our autistic young people for lots of reasons. They might have difficulty identifying their own emotions. They might have difficulty expressing or articulating why they're feeling a certain way. Um, they might have differences in facial recognition. Um, that sort of what is it called, face blindness thing, where they might have difficulty ascertaining other people's emotions by reading that on their face. So what does an angry face look like? What does a happy face look like? That might be an area of difference for them. um so there's an awful lot tied in with emotions, as well as differences in interoception. I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about that, Shona.
Yeah, I think when we get onto some more of the slides on the sensory bit, we can kind of circle back to that. But um yeah, because we will be doing a parent workshop that's all about sensory processing. So that's very linked to how we handle our emotions. So obviously being like well regulated and having a good understanding of what things you can do in terms of your senses that make you feel good is highly connected to how you feel. So the little picture of like what does worry look like that's there on the screen, this is kind of indicating that we should be trying to tune into our internal bodily signals. So if we've got like a fast beating heart, what does that tell us about how we're feeling? Because sometimes children may not always notice what's going on in their body, or they might not be able to kind of identify it. They might just know they have a very uncomfortable feeling in their tummy. So does that mean they need the toilet, or does that mean they're very worried about something? Sometimes because of the sense of interoception, which is what gives us those signals, it can be hard to know. So just doing a little bit of exploring into that and really tuning into what's going on in our bodies is a great way to kind of go about this topic of emotions.
And I think as well, it goes back to what I was saying before about, okay, the environment is going to change. There's a lot of unknowns about the physical environment of secondary school, but what's not going to change is our internal states and ourselves. So it's almost like we can do two sets of work. We can do work on understanding the physical environment and the changes in that are going to impact us, but we can also do the internal work on understanding ourselves
Mhm.
better and how we respond to different situations. So it's kind of looking at both sides of the coin, really.
Definitely. Yeah, and that kind of leads us on to thinking about school uniforms. So you may already be kind of predicting or worrying about some elements around that. So it's definitely really, really important to um, try and get the uniform as early as you can and try it on as early as you can, and really thinking about um, you know, does that feel good or does it feel uncomfortable? And maybe kind of, trying to think about, because sometimes children at home, they're very relaxed, they're in their home, they're very comfortable. So maybe something's not going to bother them as much as it might do when they're like out and about or on the bus, something may intensify. And that's because of, that sensory, like if we think about it like a cup, the cup may be getting more and more full kind of as the day goes on. So really trying to explore that with your child as well is a good way to go. And I think, yeah, Charlotte's put a point on here about double checking the regulations around footwear, because I think that's a common like tricky
Area of
point, isn't it,
contention.
Charlotte?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think just because obviously school uniform isn't cheap,
Mm,
unfortunately, and footwear definitely, especially, is not cheap. And I would say this is probably, with regards to uniform, the number one most contentious area of difficulty with regards to schools having very specific requirements around which footwear is permissible and which is not. And then obviously taking account of young people's preferences, because we know the feet have lots of receptors on them. They're a very sensitive area. And if they're walking around all day from lesson to lesson, that can be an area of where they're most uncomfortable, like new shoes rubbing and things like that, having to so it's worthwhile really thinking about the minutiae of detail with regards to stuff like breaking shoes in beforehand so that they're not wearing them for the first time on the first day and getting blisters, things like
mm,
that. So, new, very, very firm, rigid new shoes might take a couple of days to sort of
mm.
soften in and make comfortable. That kind of thing can make a huge difference to a child's like experience of their first day at
Definitely.
school, whether they just can't think about anything else because their feet are so uncomfortable, or
Yeah.
so
Whatever
yeah,
it may
just
be. So yeah, definitely. Because if you kind of can prepare ahead, so even if it's something like wearing the tie, school may have flexible policies around whether you can get a clip-on tie instead of one that
yeah,
you tie around, so it kind of alleviates that pressure slightly. So it's definitely worth like
yeah.
exploring ahead of time.
And I
I think
think
that,
even just
yeah,
that the example you gave about the tie, it might be that they didn't have to wear a tie in primary school.
yeah,
So actually, they're not used to that constricting feeling of having a done
mm,
up collar and having something around their neck. And that in itself can feel very alienating and sort of just uncomfortable because they're not used to it. So I think it's very, very difficult if all of these sensory potentially aggravating circumstances are placed on them all at the same
yeah,
time for the first time, when their nerves and anxiety are already going to be so high on the first day anyway because of the social pressures and anxieties, that if you can tease apart those two areas a little bit, it's very, very helpful. If you can just take
hmm,
baby steps in advance of that first day so that you're lessening the newness and the anxiety of it in advance as much as you possibly can, that you're taking out some of the elements that will make it more tricky for them, if that makes any sense.
Definitely, definitely does. So yeah, this slide's really just about really considering what you already know about your child's sensory profile and maybe kind of writing it all down, things that make them feel good, things that are very difficult for them, and really, really working on those skills around just supporting them to understand, because I think even just if your child has an understanding of what makes them feel good and what doesn't, I'm really like normalizing that, because actually when you start thinking about sensory profiles, we realize that we all have a sensory profile, and it's not just like an autistic thing. We all have things that we enjoy, whether it's we like to kind of tap our foot in a meeting or whether we like to play with something. I definitely always like to have a fidget. Um, and kind of just like normalizing that and understanding that um is like really, really a very, very good first step, because like we've been talking about in secondary school, there's less of that kind of like hand holding, there's less of that like it's a much bigger environment, so less of a kind of nurturing one. So if your child is able to kind of maybe say to their teacher, like quickly at the start of the lesson, oh, please, can we turn the lights down? Or, even if that might feel really difficult, maybe you can practice like writing it out, writing a note, like, dear Miss, please, can we, think about turning the lights down in this lesson for me?
Mm.
And it's things like that that can actually have like a really big difference on that like regulation. So yeah,
Yeah.
always concentrating on what's making your brain and body feel good, and just keep talking about that in lots of different contexts.
And I think as well, just following on from that, a really big one that I hear a lot from young people is an anxiety about asking to go to the toilet. That actually is so basic, isn't it? Like having their basic needs met. But actually, there might be different policies now about you're only allowed to go and break lunchtime or between lessons, or like that actually because of the differences in interoception, they might not realize until the last minute that they need the toilet. And then is it okay to ask, or are they going to be penalized in some way? So I think just that anxiety about is it okay to even ask if I can go to the toilet can be very overwhelming for some young people, because it's just not something that they've had to worry about before.
Definitely, definitely. So how can school support with this? Because, there's the last slide was kind of what you can do and what you can work on with your child, but it's also, school do have a responsibility to meet your child's sensory needs as well. So definitely have those conversations around, what are the rules around break cards? Some schools have like specific physical cards that children can have um, if they need like a movement break. Some schools have it where certain children are on a system, so the teacher knows. So it's hard for us to give specific advice because every school will have it differently, but definitely inquire. And some schools are kind of flexible around children leaving earlier if the corridors are very, very busy. And again, going to lunch earlier to avoid those kind of like smells and sounds. Um, Thinking about their seating preferences. And these are things that, this is kind of teachers, Senkos,
Mm,
form tutors' responsibilities as well. But it's good to kind of just have these things. And if you know your child really listens better when they have a fidget, you know, what are the rules around that in secondary school? Is that something we're going to need to change, or is that something that's going to be allowed? Finding out all these things kind of ahead of time.
mm,
And the bottom point is kind of like respecting stimming, which can look different for everyone. So if your child may like rock a bit or maybe flap their hands a bit, then letting school know that that's just their way of kind of keeping
mm.
themselves regulated, and it's nothing to worry about, which we might think everyone should kind of know these things, but it's still good to kind of bring it up and talk about everything, cover all your bases basically.
Mm. And I think just further to that is that once, obviously there's the other consideration of We're getting into puberty now, adolescence, all the hormones and things are about to hit. And I think this is the age where children begin to develop much more self-consciously. And a kind of consideration is usually that they just want to blend in. They don't want to stand out. They want to just be like everybody else because it feels like there's safety and security in that. But actually, it's very worth trying to consider what coping strategies work for them and what have they been using up until now that have been helpful, because it's very, very likely that those same strategies will continue to be helpful and useful in secondary school. So, as Shona was saying, things like stimming behaviours tend to increase when our anxiety is higher, or conversely, when we're excited, they might also be more apparent. So it's quite likely in these high stress situations where their anxiety is very high that they would be most inclined to show stimming behaviors that might be sort of like make it more apparent that they're neurodivergent, let's say, and they might be even more self-conscious about that. So it's kind of a bit compounding, really, that the more anxious they are about whether this will or will not be allowed, that might make them feel even more anxious about showing it or doing it. So we really try and promote this message to school in our training about celebrating difference, valuing neurodiversity, that there's nothing wrong with stimming, that, you have to obviously make a distinction if that behavior is harmful in some way to themselves or others, then that's different. But if it's a harmless behavior,
Mm,
like Shona was saying, more than likely things like rocking on a chair or doodling or fiddling with a pen or chewing a pen, or those differences do not harm anybody. So they should have a free pass on all of those areas. Other things that might be potentially distracting to other students, they'll be treated differently. But even then, I think consideration needs to be made about how the potentially negative effects on others could be lessened or ameliorated, because there's nearly always like a small adjustment that can be made that would make it better for everyone. Things that are noisy, that's, a tricky one. But yeah, things like, clicking a pen, maybe, they can just have a pen that doesn't make quite so much noise, but they can still get that feedback and that sensory input. So, there's all kinds of considerations, but I do feel strongly that stimming, you can't tell someone not to stim, because it's like saying don't breathe, don't like it's a
mm,
natural physiological response for them. So respecting those stimming behaviors and not stigmatizing them is obviously a big part of what our training and input would be to school staff. Um,
mm,
but also, work with the young person around not feeling shame
mm.
about exhibiting those
I think
behaviors as
I
well.
know something else. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I was seeing 'cause we also have a bit of a slide on self-advocacy, which would have linked up
Mm,
nicely. But
mm.
before we get into that, we've also got practicing the school journey, which again, definitely like from a sensory perspective. So you can see here, there's like a little that picture, my senses journey to school. And there's lots and lots of things like this. Like the good thing about transitioning to year seven is that there's lots of resources about this area because it's like hard for all children. So there's tons of things online to support and yeah, things to consider. But things like the journey, that might be something that you've already thought about. So you may already be kind of thinking about this and planning it for the summer.
Yeah. And I think something that we don't often consider, we think about noise, and most of us have heard or seen like ear defenders in use, and it might be that that's a good strategy that works for your child or not. Perhaps they really don't like those. You know your child, and you can only ever just try out things and see what works and what doesn't. I think definitely with secondary school, most young people that I've worked with who benefit from ear defenders for noisy periods, like um, maybe in the corridors,
Mm,
transitioning between lessons, like walking from the classroom into the hall for assembly, for example. If they're used to wearing ear defenders during those times and they're helpful, then that's obviously a strategy that works for them. But they might feel self-conscious with everybody, with that being visible to others, that they're needing to use a strategy. So it might be that they would prefer a more discreet option that's going to offer a similar sensory benefit, like earbuds, headphones, perhaps, so that it doesn't look very different, but it's performing the same function of blocking out lots of the noise. And then also smell. That's something we don't often consider, but can have a really, really detrimental effect. Just things like, okay, you're walking down the high street, and the smell when you walk past the rubbish bins or the fishmongers, it can be very, very oppressive. And so it's just worth considering in those moments, can we practice holding our breath for a few minutes while we walk past the tip, or, perhaps like have a little scented handkerchief or something with their favorite scent that they can inhale for just those few steps past the fishmongers. Like that, it might be something like that that they need to consider on that different route to school and
absolutely.
practice.
Yeah, 100%. And this is the slide I was talking about self-advocacy. So it's quite a big topic again. But there's lots of little ways that you can support your child to practice this, whether it's you start working on them being able to kind of they might pay at the checkout when you've done the shop kind of thing, or you might give them a few more little tasks to really like boost that independence instead of immediately jumping in, which is our natural instinct to kind of offer help. You might just try and work on seeing if they've got those skills to be able to ask for help. And if they don't, that's completely fine. And figuring out a way. So it might be that like you make a little visual that says like I need some help, or you give them a little notebook and pen so that if they're struggling verbally to kind of get across what they need, they can write it down. Or yeah, even just like expressing an opinion is a very like big skill in a way that we kind of often overlook. And it's a big one for secondary school too, as there's a lot more group work and independent work, and just those kind of like meeting new people skills as well. So yeah, maybe just you might want to just ask your child a bit more like, oh, what do you think about that? And kind of seeing how they kind of react to that. And then, it might be that they are completely fine on this area. So, it's just picking what you think they might need to kind of develop a little bit further. So
Mm,
explaining a boundary again is quite a big one. So, you know, if someone's kind of asking, oh, can I copy your homework? And it might be that you go through a few little scenarios or role plays. And again, there's lots of things online to kind of support you with these types of scenarios you might want to run through. But even just something as simple as just like telling your child like it's okay to say no, which I'm sure, we already do, but I think at this kind of like crucial point, even if it's repetitive,
mm,
like maybe you've kind of think you covered all this when they were younger, but maybe you just revisit everything just to be sure, because I think
yeah.
like, saying no and asking for help, we obviously talk to children about these things like from quite an early age, but maybe this is just the time to almost like revisit some of that
Yeah.
work you might have already done.
It is because, like you say, one thing we know about how autistic minds work is sometimes autistic young people have difficulty making connections in their like transferring this. They might have practiced these skills in one context, but because you're changing the context of where you're expecting them to operate these skills, they might not make the connection like, oh, this scenario is like that other time when I had to say no to somebody, or like it's everything else around them has changed. So you need to, it's almost like making everything very explicit and spelling it out that like it's still okay to do these things, or just helping them to make comparisons across different contexts. So the example you just gave, Shona, about what if a peer says, is it okay to copy your homework? What do you say? Because on the one hand, um, they might be absolutely desperate to be liked and to make friends, and they might feel that that's a great way to form a bond with somebody. Like, oh, that's great. They're asking me for something, and that's something I can do for them. But then actually considering the flip side of that, which is that if you both submit identical work, the teacher's more than likely going to notice, and then you might get into trouble because she might think that you've copied somebody else. So it's that's kind of like, oh dear, if you
Mm,
have a funny feeling about it, then perhaps that's your body telling you that it might not be the best
mm,
thing to agree to. So you really need to, it's a,
check
it's a
in.
tricky it's a tricky thing to navigate, I think, that scenario. But that's a perfect
Yeah.
it's a perfect example of how you could do a practice role play, for example.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And you're never going to be able to practice every scenario, but just being I think like just being aware that these situations might come up. So talking about them and creating an environment where, your child feels like they can come to you with little things that might have happened throughout the
Mm.
day.
But
Um,
I mean, that will make the difference to them between
mm,
like, because if they're encountering that situation for the very first time and it's so unfamiliar to them, it can just make the difference between like throwing them off for the entire day, or, oh, actually, I practiced this with my mum. I know what I could say here. Do you know what I mean? Like, I
yeah,
think that like
definitely.
Shona said, we're never going to be able to anticipate and foreshadow every single difficulty that they're going to encounter. That's just impossible. But it's possible to make some generalizations or guesses, informed guesses about
Mm,
these areas are likely to be tricky, or we could do more work around this in case. I
mm,
think that's kind of what you're sort
yeah,
of,
aiming for.
yeah.
So cool. So a lot of autistic um, children and young people might have different ways of communicating, and this can look all kinds of different ways. So it might be that they really, really like to talk about what's interesting to them. It might be that they prefer to write things down. It might be that they communicate through like doing activities together rather than like chatting. It can be this can look completely different for everyone. Um, so one thing that we wanted to highlight is a strategy that can be used, which is called comic strip conversations. So you might have heard of this strategy before. And it's a visual representation of a conversation, and it uses like drawings and symbols to represent social interactions. Oh, is someone having to leave, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, we'll just carry on. Actually, we're gonna get through our last few slides and then we'll have time for some questions. But yeah, so this strategy is just definitely a great one to be aware of because it really helps break down those kind of nuances of a social interaction that your child might have had, because they might come home and yeah, maybe um feel upset about the way something's gone, a conversation is gone. Maybe they didn't understand a joke. Maybe there's someone in their class they want to be friends with, but they're not sure how to go about it. So using this type of visual strategy is really supportive, and can really help like break down that difference between what people say and what people might be thinking. Because I think that can kind of become a bit of a sticky area for some young people, is that not everyone is a clear communicator, and that's like a massive strength for some autistic people in how they communicate. They might be very to the point and direct, and they always say what they mean, and that can be a wonderful thing, but actually not everyone's like that. So in school they may come across young people who kind of say one thing but act in a different way. So if we can use a strategy like this to kind of break down those differences, it can be really helpful. And you can also use it for like positive interactions too. If something, if a conversation's gone really well and they come home and say, yes, like that was great, you can also kind of like write that out as a little like example of you can do it, a little confidence builder. So that's just one strategy to kind of support with communication differences.
Yeah, and just to say, obviously, we do a whole training just on
Yes,
comic
that was
strip
whistle
conversations.
stop
So
introduction of comic strip conversations.
obviously,
Yeah.
you might want to do a bit more learning about that. There is a lot of information available online. Carol Gray is the person who sort of developed that as a strategy. So if you Google Carol Gray comic strip conversations, a bit more information will come up. Yeah, okay. So on to friendships. This is obviously a huge area because this is likely to be something that they may have found tricky previously. And it could be that they spent years cultivating a really small, tight-knit group of friends in primary school, and they feel very, very anxious about leaving those friendships and starting new ones. And I think obviously all those feelings are totally valid and totally normal, and we can all identify with that. Everybody has left a job and had anxieties about stepping into the unknown and beginning at a new workplace where you don't know your colleagues, and there's that settling in period of getting to know people, and it's hard. It is hard. But I think another thing that we can do is support them maintaining their previous friendships and relationships that they developed in primary school as well. That, like, you can just reassure them that just because you're no longer going to school every day with those people doesn't mean you'll never see them again. You can still meet up with them outside of school. We can still arrange, to speak on the phone. None of those people are out of bounds or out of reach anymore. And that's one of the great things about, all the advances in communication as well, is that, like, it's easier than ever with the advent of the internet and everything for us to stay in touch with people, and anyone who's been an asset in your child's life, there's the option of keeping them on. So just to reassure them that it doesn't mean an end, because I think autistic brains can be very finite and sort of, what's the word, like they might have interpreted the closing of a chapter and the finishing of secondary school. They might be associating that really strongly with, like, these people will no longer be in my life. So it might be worth just reassuring them that that's not necessarily going to be the case, that that's a positive for all the inconvenient things that they don't perhaps love about primary school, that those will now be ended or finished, and there might be certain people that they've had tricky relationships with that they no longer have to see, which is a great thing. But also they might have really good friends, and they want to keep those people in their life, and that's okay. um Equally, they will need to make some new friends, even if they have, we often see children make different friends in secondary school. So even if one or two of their very, very good friends are starting at the same secondary school as they are, it might be that their interests shift, that actually they're not quite as compatible as they used to be, that they find people who they have more in common with, and that their relationship drifts a little and isn't quite the same. So things will change. Obviously, it's probably reassuring in the first few weeks and months to have someone familiar that they do know from primary school around, but it just worth kind of considering that the nature of their relationship may not have continuity in that respect. They might be in different form groups. They might have, different groups of friends going forward. Um, and yeah, just how important friendships are, and stating the obvious, but just some of the best ways for children to make friends who may be a bit socially awkward is things like interest-based clubs. So lots of secondary schools are great at offering things like lunchtime clubs, after school clubs. There might be a much wider variety of those than there was at primary school. Primary schools are getting much better at this. There's often, sports-based clubs and arts and crafts maybe, or language clubs, or computer club. Or in secondary school, the possibilities are endless. It's almost, there's so much choice. There's so much available for them to choose from. So, it could be that they have the opportunity to join a new club that they haven't tried before and they absolutely love it. Or so that's another thing. And then some schools are great and they have a buddy mentor system already in place, whereby an older child is assigned to a new year 7 child to help navigate some of those challenges, to help show them around the school physically. But more than that, just being like a potential person that they can call upon or ask questions of, is really nice. So that may have already been part of your child's induction day experience, that they were shown around the school by students in older years, and they could have already been assigned someone. I mean, it would be fantastic if they were. I'd be really interested to hear your experiences about that. But even in a less formal way, it could be just that that there's maybe a child on your road who goes to your child's secondary school already, so just arranging an informal chat with that with the parent of that child, like, okay, they're in year 10, so they've been at the school for 4 years already, so perhaps they can give them a bit of reassurance, like, oh, this teacher's lovely, or this subject is amazing, or join this club because that's really cool. Children can get a lot of helpful reassurance by speaking to older children about their experiences of the school. Obviously, you have to have a little bit of caution that there isn't sort of scaremongering and stuff as well, because they probably will say like, oh, this teacher's really strict, or be careful of, that kind of thing. So make sure it's a balanced, fair conversation with positives and negatives, I would say.
Nice. And then
And
yeah, just
yeah, we
yeah.
kind of covered this a bit
Mm.
already, the organization side. And again, we do trainings just on executive functioning skills. So this is a very, very huge area to unpack. But sometimes it is just the logistical side of secondary school that children find most challenging. Things like budgeting. It may be that they've never had to do that before, that they've always had school lunches and they've never used like physical money or a card. They've never had to consider how much things cost, if it's like a canteen type environment. All of those things are very, very closely tied with executive functioning. Things like bringing the right equipment to the right lessons. It sounds so basic, but in primary school, usually that's kind of already taken care of for you. Like, okay, we're going to do maths, and let's give out the rulers and the protractors, or we're going to do cooking, put on an apron. In secondary school, a lot of the responsibility for that is going to shift onto them, because there's just too many students. So it might be that suddenly they're responsible for bringing their own calculator to maths, or their own lab coat and goggles to science. So suddenly there's just a lot more to remember and think about. So it might be that for the first few weeks at least, you actually sit down with them the night before with their timetable, look at what lessons they're going to have the next day, and pack their school bag together so that you make sure that they've got all the right equipment that they're going to need for the next day's lessons. And obviously that does take time. It's not easy, but hopefully after it's been done a few times and you've modeled that with them and shown them a method that works for them, it could be that then you just make up like a checklist for them to tick off. Like, have you got your homework planner? Tick. Pencil case? Tick. You know, maths textbook? Tick. Like tomorrow's Wednesday because today is Tuesday. So let's look at what lessons you've got tomorrow, what equipment you're going to need for them, then put them in the bag and then check that you've got all of it. It's almost like you kind of have to make like a system that works for you and them.
Absolutely.
And
Homework,
then just,
another big topic.
yeah, just to say as well, homework is a huge challenge because I think in lots of primary schools, I mean, who likes homework? Few children do. Some children, again, there's that rigidity in thinking for lots of autistic children that they might not understand the point of homework. They might just associate learning very, very closely with the school physical environment, and that actually home is their relaxing time, their safe space, so they're very resistant to homework generally. I mean, you are going to have to help them overcome that. If they're joining a mainstream setting, it will be an expectation that they are likely to get much more homework than they did previously. So, how can we help them with that? Well, there's a few ways. I think one of the blessings of the modern technological environment is that things are much more automated online these days. They're not likely to have so many kind of like physical paper copies of things that can get lost, damaged, ripped, etc. So that might really work for them in a positive way. On the other hand, if they're not used to submitting things online and stuff, it's going to take a little bit of practice. So most schools now, I think, operate kind of online learning platforms like Google Classroom, or might have its own name. My son's school, they have Seesaw, an app called Seesaw, but basically where you submit homework online and then it's marked and you receive the feedback as well by logging into the app or the website or whatever it is. And it might be as well that they have some kind of like online behavior system where they keep track of like merits and things like that, so that you can see at a glance as a parent as well, whether they've been awarded house points or credits, or whatever language and terminology is used by the school. So it could be that there's details of that on the website that you can have a look in advance of, and try and navigate around that and familiarize yourself with how notifications about homework are going to appear, and yeah, all of the sort of visual side of that. We know our children are very visual, so if you can and sort of unpick exactly what things will look like, it's going to help them know what to expect. Yeah, and just following on from that, I mean, here's an example. I think this is from the Chestnut Grove website. Yes, it's got just the timetable of the day. So if you have a look on your child's new secondary school website, there is quite a lot of information available on some of them. So they might have, for example, pictures of staff members, so that even just something as simple as like, okay, they've been given their new timetable with all the new subjects and different teachers' names, and just being able to look and putting a face to a name, like, oh, that's what Miss Smith looks like, or that's what, Mr. Patel looks like. That might just provide some level of familiarity and reassurance to them. So most school websites do have lists of, key members of staff, like form tutors, heads of year, subject teachers, things like that they can look in advance. Um, Information about what reward systems are in use, things around like the protocol for detentions or merits, or the uniform we've already spoken about. Maybe even the foods that are available in the canteen. That could be an anxiety for them. What if there's nothing there that I want to eat for lunch? Am I going to be hungry all day? So have a look at what the catering options are. And if none of them are appealing, perhaps a packed lunch is the way to go. These are all things that you can try to research and anticipate in advance.
Absolutely. Okay, this is our last slide, just a roundup of our top tips.
Yeah, so I think that's most things covered. Sorry, we've kind of gone slightly over. Um, just try and be positive about it. And like we said, I know it's hard because you're anxious for them, but I think we can all look back and appreciate you may or may not have very vivid memories of your first day of secondary school. I could remember it vaguely, and I think that it's always a very mixed picture, a very, time of mixed feelings. And it's likely to be very daunting for them. It's likely to be quite overwhelming. So the more reassuring and positive you can be, the better. They're going to be looking to you for guidance and support. So obviously, it's really preferable that you give the impression that things are going to be okay, that it's nothing to be scared about, that it's okay to have worries and anxieties, but you're there if they do want to talk to anybody about that, and that in all likelihood they're going to be absolutely fine.